Hey everyone, and welcome to another video in the garden. Today we're going to be taking a look at deadheading. Effectively, deadheading is the practice of cutting off the heads of spent flowers so that you can get more blooms. This will prolong the flowering season, it'll make the plant stronger overall, and it'll just keep things flowering when typically, if you don't do this, the flowering period for some of these plants can be incredibly short. Now, not every plant needs to be deadheaded, and I'm not here to give an extensive list because honestly, I would be here for hours. Instead, I'm more here to teach about how to deadhead plants effectively and some of the different ways that different plants like to be deadheaded. I recommend checking out the RHS website if you're looking for specific instructions on different plants within your garden for which ones should be deadheaded and which ones shouldn't, because again, the list is just too long. But let's get into the ones that can and should be deadheaded and how we do that. Now, here's the most common way of deadheading a plant. Once we see a spent flower head like this one on the Cosmos, simply what we'll do is we will follow the stem down to where it meets some more growth. As we can see, there are some new flower heads coming up there, and we will simply snip it off. You could pull it off with your finger, however, sometimes you run the risk of pulling off more than you'd like to. So I recommend using some secateurs, which can help, just give you a nice clean cut. Now, the reason why we cut at the base rather than cutting at the top is one, it's just neater that way. It looks a lot better than just having a long stem with nothing at the end. And also, it's hopefully going to encourage this plant to stem more from that cut. So hopefully what will happen is, because we cut there, it'll sprout two more from that little cut, which means more blooms for us. That isn't the case with every single plant, but I tend to find that's a pretty good rule of thumb, that you will tend to see two sort of come from that bit. As you can see on this one here, we've got one growing in the middle and two kind of coming from the side. So if we cut that middle one off, hopefully we would see even more sort of stem from that. So that's why we deadhead plants, to get more and more flowers throughout the season. If we actually decided to just leave these deadheads on, like what you can see here, what the plant would do is go to seed. The plant's main goal is just to create seeds. That's literally what they exist for, pretty much. Their purpose anyways. So if we let it go to seed, which is what it wants to do, it'll stop flowering. It'll basically give up. It won't want to do it anymore. It'll say, I've done my job. I don't need to do anything else. So we want to trick it into thinking, no, you can't go to seed. There are no seeds to be made. You have to keep flowering. That's why we cut them off as soon as they're spent. So a good rule of thumb is, if you see a flower head looking as bad as this, which this one looks really bad at the moment, you cut it off. And you can keep the seeds if you want, although I think at this stage, the seeds aren't going to be really any good. I think you generally want to wait until later on in the year, and I'm going to get into that now about when you should stop deadheading plants. So this one is a Naughtia, and it absolutely loves to be deadheaded. We can kind of tell which ones need to, because I mean, just look at that. It's got no little petals on it anymore, whereas the ones that are still coming through are a little bit more, they've got a different design. This one's a bit kind of fluffy. It looks worn out, whereas this one you can kind of tell it's just coming in. So what we do is, once again, we find it at the base and we just cut it off. You can put it somewhere, do whatever you want, same sort of principle. But when do we stop deadheading? Well, effectively, we're going to stop deadheading once we stop seeing these new ones come up. Now, the reason for that is, obviously, if you just keep deadheading, you end up with no plants at the end of the year and no seeds to collect. So if you're someone who wants to collect seeds from your plants to grow more, make sure you leave some of these heads on and let them turn into seed heads, and then collect them in the autumn time. If you don't do that, then you're not going to have any seeds. So it's definitely important to remember that. Keep an eye on whether new growth is still coming through, and if it is, then brilliant, you can keep deadheading. But if it has stopped, then make sure you stop as well, unless you don't want the seeds. If you don't, then you can just stop, and that's completely up to you. You can keep deadheading or stop, whatever you feel is best for the plant and the look. But yeah, that's just a rule if you want to keep the seeds. As I mentioned with some of those plants, you just go down to the next bit of growth and cut the head off. It's very easy, but not all plants want to be deadheaded like that. That's not the best way for them. For example, with these geums, which have these really long stems sort of held above the growth lower down, what you actually want to do is find a stem that is completely spent. So let all of the flowers go to seed effectively, which is fine on this one because it's actually I don't know the right word, sterile, that's it. It's a sterile plant, so this actually won't make any seeds. So don't bother cutting off all these little ones individually. That's pointless. That's not gonna really help. Instead, find one of these long stems, follow it all the way to the bottom of the plant, right to the base, and cut it off. And then, as you can see, rather than it continuing on from this one stem and getting all straggly, it'll generate new ones, like so. And that is the beauty of a sterile plant. Because they're not generating new seeds, you know, they're going to keep on flowering again and again. So deadheading, maybe not as important, at least in the sense of you don't have to be constantly keeping up with cutting off these heads, but you want to cut off the whole stem basically, like you've seen me do over there, so that new ones can sprout from the bottom. I generally find that if you've got a plant like a geum, which has really long stems like this, coming from an amount of bushy growth at the bottom, you cut from the bottom. It's not a be-it-end-all rule, but I found that's pretty common. Another one that's similar to that is Astrantia. Again, it's got these long sort of stems kind of coming up from the bottom, so I go right to the bottom and cut them off rather than cutting off each little head. It applies to lots of different plants. Again, you'd have to look at their RHS pages and see which ones you've got in your garden and which ones kind of need that treatment. For plants like this Salvia caradonna, I generally don't keep on top of deadheading it constantly. Instead, what I do is I give it one big deadhead. Now, some people call this a Chelsea chop, although I'm not necessarily going through and just roughly chopping everything off. I will still deadhead it. Like you can see here, I've kind of looked to see where the new stems are coming through, and then I've cut off the old ones. So after a point when I notice that a ton of the stems are looking spent and old, I will go through and cut them all off so that the new ones have the energy to shine. Because once we cut those old dead ones off, we'll be giving the plant the energy to sprout up these new ones and make them nice and strong. So that's something good to do. There are also some plants that you just don't really deadhead at all. For example, a good one in my opinion is Verbena bonariensis. It'll generally keep these sort of flowery heads on it throughout most of the year anyways, but if they start looking rough, it's just one of those ones you don't deadhead. Maybe there are some people out there who do, but personally I never have, and I've always been told just don't bother, you don't really need to do that with that plant. So yeah, it's kind of the same with Echinops, I think. I'm pretty sure that if you deadhead it, it's not going to come up with more. I'm not an expert on this, but it's just one of those ones that, again, I've never really deadheaded. The plant's been just fine. And also, you kind of want to keep some of these plants around for their structural interest. Verbena will keep really nicely over winter and keep its sort of structure. Same with the Echinops, the blue one in the middle. So if you get rid of all the heads on them, you might find yourself later on in the year not having that interest. It might just stop, and then you'll be really disappointed that you've gotten rid of all of the heads on it. So yeah, not always the sort of thing you should actually do. It's really up to you ultimately, but yeah, I always say think twice before you deadhead. Maybe check the RHS page and see whether it recommends you should or not, because yeah, sometimes you actually don't need to, and you might end up doing more harm than good. But yeah, that's everything for now. I hope you enjoyed this little guide on deadheading. Let me know, what plants do you think need to be deadheaded within your garden? I will catch you in the next video.